It began not with thunder, but with a whisper. A single leak in Brussels, dismissed by many as a rumor, carried the weight of an economic bombshell. Donald Trump, standing before NATO allies, demanded a new line of attack, raised tariffs on Africa's oil and gold until the continent bent its knee. In his words, it was strategy. In Africa's ears, it was suffocation. For Europe and America, these commodities were luxuries turned into lifelines. The gold that underpinned banking systems, the oil that kept Mediterranean refineries alive. But for Africa, the message was blunt: surrender your sovereignty or starve. In Ouagadougou, the response was very different. Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to flinch. He named it for what it was: economic warfare disguised as diplomacy. And then, instead of silence, he prepared fire. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and walk with us as we journey through the struggle for dignity. What followed would not only rattle NATO's chambers, but redraw the very map of power. The question was no longer about trade. It was about Africa's right to stand tall. The memo was never meant to leave the velvet chambers of Brussels. It was a draft, stamped confidential, designed to circulate only among ministers and advisors. Yet late one evening, a single page slipped into the hands of an anonymous journalist. Its content was explosive. Washington had pressed Europe to prepare tariffs that would choke Africa's oil and gold exports, forcing the continent to its knees. The timing was deliberate. Africa's rise in global markets had unsettled long-standing hierarchies. Nations once seen only as suppliers of raw ore and crude were beginning to talk of refining, of processing, of trading on their own terms. For Donald Trump and his allies, the threat was clear. If Africa succeeded, the West's grip on global order could fracture. And so the plan was drafted in secret corridors: suffocate Africa's oil and gold until compliance returned. When the report broke, European capitals reacted with silence. The language was brutal, yet few dared to challenge Washington openly. Only whispers of unease trickled out. But in Ouagadougou, the effect was electric. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not see rumor. He saw declaration, not of policy, but of war. Before dawn, he summoned his advisors. Around the table, maps of pipelines and mining concessions lay scattered. Traoré's words cut through the dim light. "This is not about tariffs," he said. "This is about control. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow." His tone was not one of despair, but of defiance. The message was clear. Africa would not be silenced. By mid-morning, calls went out across the Sahel. Mali, Guinea, Niger, leaders were invited not as diplomats, but as guardians of sovereignty. Within days, they gathered in a closed summit. No chandeliers, no Parisian backdrops, no Geneva protocols, but in the heart of West Africa, in rooms heavy with tension and dust. Each voice recounted the same pattern: gold siphoned out through contracts signed in foreign capitals, oil drilled by companies whose revenues vanished overseas, villages left in poverty, while refineries in Europe thrived. For decades, Africa had begged for loans and been told to wait for aid. But on that day, the language shifted. Aid was no longer on the table. Partnership was no longer enough. The demand was dignity. It was Traoré who framed the choice. If the West dared to impose tariffs, Africa would dare something greater. Oil and gold, the oxygen of Europe's markets, would be withheld. If they want to gamble with our lifeblood, then we will gamble with theirs, he declared. Silence fell. It was not the silence of fear, but of calculation. Leaders weighed the risks: hunger, shortages, unrest. Yet one by one, they nodded. For the first time in decades, the fractured voices of Africa converged into a single, unyielding answer. Outside the walls, the streets stirred. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, chants echoed. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. In Bamako's markets, whispers spread. Europe may cut us off, but this time, Africa will answer. What began as a leak in Brussels had now ignited a fire in West Africa. It was no longer about policy memos. It was about survival with dignity. But what came next would not only shake Africa's capitals, it would send shockwaves into the trading floors of Europe itself. The decision of the Sahel Summit traveled faster than any official communiqué. It was not ministers in suits who broke the news, but radio hosts, market vendors, and students tapping messages onto battered smartphones. By evening, the story was alive in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. If tariffs were imposed, Africa would shut down the flow of oil and gold. The reaction was instant and visceral. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student raised a hand-painted sign. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. The crowd erupted. For decades, Africa had watched its lifeblood siphoned abroad while being told to be grateful for aid. Now, for the first time, leaders dared to say no. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood the gravity. Appearing on national television, he did not stand flanked by generals or cloaked in ceremony. Instead, he stood before ordinary miners with dust still clinging to their overalls, farmers with calloused hands, and engineers in worn jackets. His voice carried steady and unpolished. They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Power was not behind palace gates, but shoulder to shoulder with those who toiled in the fields and mines. Across the continent, the speech resonated. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight of oil barrels wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers as the speech replayed. On social media, one phrase spread like wildfire. If Traoré stands, we stand. Europe, however, did not cheer. In Frankfurt, traders watched gold prices rocket upward, screens flashing crimson. In Paris, energy planners admitted uneasily that more than half of France's nuclear grid depended on Nigerian uranium, a lifeline now uncertain. In Milan, executives whispered in panic. Without cobalt and lithium from Congo, electric car factories would grind to a halt. For the first time, European leaders grasped the scale of dependency. Oil and gold were not luxuries, they were oxygen. And now, Traoré's hand was firmly on the valve. Inside Brussels, late-night meetings turned frantic. Public speeches still invoked partnership and aid, but the documents on the desks told a harsher truth. Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe. Some ministers whispered doubt. Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves. But few dared to oppose Washington openly. Meanwhile, BRICS nations seized their opening. In Beijing, trade officials unveiled emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks entirely. In Moscow, delegations proposed joint ventures in refining and drilling. In New Delhi, a bold gesture, a pledge to purchase Sahelian crude under long-term contracts, ensured that even if Europe turned away, Africa would have a buyer. These moves sent a clear signal. Africa would not stand alone. For every door the West tried to close, another seemed to open in the East. Yet Traoré and his allies did not leap blindly. They knew one form of dependency could be swapped too easily for another. Economists were dispatched to secure stockpiles. Engineers worked overnight to fortify grids. Troops were sent to guard mining zones. Across Africa, the atmosphere was tense, but resolute. Markets buzzed with rumors of shortages. Mothers worried about medicine and school fees. Farmers wondered if their harvests would find buyers. Fear was real, yet beneath it burned something stronger: pride. The world was watching, and the balance was shifting. What began as whispers of tariffs had grown into a confrontation that rattled markets, divided Europe, and emboldened Africa. But the West was not prepared to surrender so easily. The counterattack did not arrive with tanks or soldiers, but through ledgers, networks, and screens. Within days of Africa's defiant stand, European banks began freezing accounts tied to state-owned companies in Burkina Faso and Mali. Cargo ships heavy with crude and bullion were stalled in Mediterranean ports, their papers suddenly under review. Insurance firms refused to cover African shipments, leaving oil tankers stranded, gold consignments idle. Then came the digital front. Cyber units probed government servers in Ouagadougou and Bamako, crashing websites, disrupting payment systems, destabilizing fragile grids. The official narrative was swift. This was not retaliation, only technical irregularities. But for African capitals, the message was unmistakable. This was pressure cloaked in bureaucracy. Western media piled on. Editorials painted Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, a strong man gambling with his people's survival. Late-night panels in London and Paris predicted hunger, unrest, collapse. The storyline was clear. Africa's gamble would fail. Yet reality was more complicated. Families did feel the pinch. Medicines harder to find, food prices rising, fuel rationed. But rather than fracture, communities closed ranks. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students organized solidarity networks to keep schools open. Farmers pooled resources, ensuring harvests reached markets without relying on foreign intermediaries. What was meant to divide began to weld together. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, responded with pragmatism that startled outside observers. Resource convoys were escorted by joint security forces. Local banks launched gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western transfers. Engineers worked day and night to stabilize grids under siege. And in Ouagadougou, a national reserve fund was announced. Oil and gold revenues stockpiled not for foreign creditors, but for Africa's rainy day. The transformation was subtle but profound. What had been dependency was turning into resilience. Where once policy was dictated from abroad, now choices were forged in African capitals. It was not perfect, it was not without pain, but it was sovereignty in practice. Sovereignty carried on weary shoulders. International analysts debated the tipping point. Would hardship break the resolve? Would protests force Traore to relent? Yet on the ground, a different mood prevailed. Yes, electricity flickered. Yes, shelves were thin. But people spoke of dignity, of sacrifices endured not for nothing, but for a cause greater than survival. It was in this climate that Traore's stand began to be called something larger than defiance. To some, it was the first step of an Ibrahim Traoré coup against centuries of economic subjugation. Not a coup with rifles, but with resolve. A coup measured not in seized palaces, but in reclaimed pride. Europe, meanwhile, wrestled with contradictions. Ministers debated tariffs while auto executives fretted about cobalt, while energy planners counted uranium shipments, while traders watched gold reserves shrink. The louder Washington pushed, the more hesitation surfaced in Berlin, Paris, Rome. They knew the punishment designed for Africa was boomeranging with unsettling speed. Across the Atlantic, Trump thundered at rallies. Africa will crawl back, he declared. The crowds roared. But beyond the cheering, diplomats heard another sound, the creak of an order straining under its own arrogance. For Africa, the question was no longer whether it could endure. The question was what it might become if endurance gave way to independence. But just as Africa began to adapt, another revelation detonated like a thunderclap, one that would transform hardship into fury and expose the deeper design behind the tariffs. The second leak did not emerge from African soil, but once again from Europe itself. An investigative journalist, the same shadowed figure who had first revealed the Brussels memo, returned with documents that struck harder than tariffs ever could. These were not whispers of strategy, but draft contracts and private correspondences. Their content was chilling. Long before sanctions or duties were debated, Western conglomerates had already prepared agreements to privatize Africa's oil fields and gold mines for half a century. Buried in legal jargon were clauses that spoke volumes. Niger's oil reserves, leased for 50 years at cut-rate prices. Gold from Burkina Faso, diverted directly into offshore accounts in London. The truth was stark. Tariffs were never the end game. They were the opening move in a scheme to secure permanent control. The reaction was volcanic. Crowds in Bamako stormed foreign company offices demanding accountability. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré convened parliament and declared, "Now the mask has fallen." This was never about fairness. It was theft dressed as policy. His words ignited a continent already under strain. Across Africa, momentum built. The AES announced a sweeping review of every foreign contract signed in the past 2 decades. Protesters in Lagos, Kinshasa, and Dar es Salaam carried placards that read, "No more hidden chains." Diaspora communities rallied in Paris and New York, demanding transparency not from their African governments, but from Western corporations. Europe's leaders scrambled, some denied, calling the documents fabrications. Others fell silent, fearing political suicide if they contradicted Washington too openly. Analysts confirmed that the signatures and figures matched historic colonial-era precedents. What had been dismissed as conspiracy was now undeniable fact. Internationally, the narrative began to shift. In South America, activists drew parallels with their own histories of resource plunder. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity. For the first time in living memory, Africa was not painted as a supplicant, but as a protagonist. What began as a dispute over tariffs had grown into something larger, a Burkina Faso revolution of mindset and identity. The revelation forced a question that European ministers could not easily answer. If one small, landlocked nation could refuse, what stopped others from following? The mask had fallen, and now the struggle was not about tariffs or shipments, but about the very right of Africa to own its future. The storm had stripped away illusions. What began as a dispute over tariffs had revealed something deeper. The unspoken truth that Africa's wealth had long been treated as collateral for someone else's prosperity. Now, with the mask removed, the continent faced a choice: retreat under pressure or chart a new course of sovereignty. At the heart of Ouagadougou, leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States convened once more. This time, the agenda was not survival, but vision. Draft papers outlined what would become known as the African Resource Charter, a framework that treated oil, gold, and minerals not as commodities for export, but as instruments of independence. The principle was simple: no more raw extraction without value addition. No more contracts signed in distant boardrooms. No more silent leakage of lifeblood. The road ahead was perilous. Building new refineries, creating independent financial systems, forging internal markets. These were tasks that required years of patience and discipline. Hardship would not vanish overnight. Shelves might remain thin, grids unstable, treasuries strained. Yet the sacrifices now carried a different weight. They were no longer endured in silence, but embraced as steps toward a destiny chosen, not imposed. The international landscape, too, had shifted. BRICS nations offered deals and lifelines, but Traore and his allies moved cautiously. Dependency, whether Western or Eastern, was still dependency. Africa's leaders knew the test would not be in resisting tariffs, but in resisting the temptation to trade one master for another. For ordinary Africans, hope mingled with fear. Farmers asked whether future harvests would find markets within the continent. Students debated whether dignity could fill empty stomachs. Mothers wondered if medicine would come in time. Yet even in these doubts, there was a newfound conviction that suffering with dignity was better than living forever on bended knees. The path was uncertain, but the direction was clear. A continent long treated as a marketplace was now daring to demand equality. Each crisis that had been designed to break it had instead welded it stronger. Each sanction had become a lesson in resilience. Each smear had been answered with unity. History rarely announces turning points. Often they begin as whispers, dismissed as passing storms. But in the Sahel, the whisper had become a chorus, and the chorus was rewriting the map. And so, history itself seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for Africa's next move. What began as a whisper in Brussels had erupted into a storm that shook the foundations of global order. A single leak, a single page, had revealed more than tariffs. It exposed a century-old pattern of dependency dressed in new clothes. And when faced with the choice between submission and sacrifice, Africa chose dignity. From the crowded markets of Bamako to the dusty villages of Niger, from Ouagadougou's Independence Square to diaspora rallies in Paris and New York, one message resounded: sovereignty is worth more than comfort, dignity more than gold. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center of this defiance. But the story was never his alone. It was the story of a continent that refused to kneel. For Europe and America, the mirror was uncomfortable. They discovered that Africa's oil and gold were not background noise, but the oxygen of their economies. They learned that the continent they once underestimated could, with a single decision, rattle markets, divide allies, and inspire a generation. The question now is not whether Africa can survive without Europe, but whether Europe can survive without Africa. This was not just a trade dispute. It was an Ibrahim Traoré coup against silence, a rebellion of dignity against dependency, and it carried the pulse of a wider movement, a Burkina Faso revolution of the mind, one that insists Africa's future will be written not in foreign boardrooms, but in African hands. The path ahead is uncertain. Hardship will test resolve. Temptation will test unity. But the seed has been planted. The harvest, when it comes, may transform not just Africa, but the world itself. So we end not with an answer, but with a question. If one small landlocked nation can stand, what stops the rest of the continent? If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and add your voice, because history is being written, and silence is no longer an option.